Okay. So last time we talked about kind of like the early wave of feminist anthropology associated with kind of politically with second wave feminism in the 1970s in the United States, right? Sally Slocum, Sherry Ordner, and that kind of crew, we're all kind of big into that, right? And we saw, it's not the only one, but I think it is kind of the best introduction to just how these biases are kind of built into anthropology. And she did kind of the male biases, but I think there's all kinds of biases that we can recognize, like, ethnocentric biases, gender-centric biases, maybe, associated with certain kinds of people or certain things like that. And in the 80s and 90s in anthropology, a lot of research came out in populations that were traditionally kind of marginalized within anthropology, right? There's some really classic 80s anthropology studying, crack dealers in Harlem, or studying sex workers, or studying, kind of these marginal populations who, back in the day in anthropology, like, oh, we're not going to study them, right? We only study the good people, right? Those are marginal people. They're problematic. They're criminals or whatever, right? So trying to really understand the whole of the human experience. And we kind of looked at how that went with gender, and kinship is very closely related to gender, especially in anthropology, right? We often think of kinship and gender. We have a weekend intro to cultural anthropology. We talk about marriage. We make family trees. We talk about cross cousins and things like that, right? The kind of traditional gender and kinship unit in anthropology. This is what we think of, right? Circles and triangles. I think I actually used that exact same one in our PowerPoint, right? And so what does this show us? Before we critique it too much, what is this? And why is anthropology obsessed with kinship? What is it? Yeah, within different families, show who's related to who. It's super useful. Like when I did my master's fieldwork, I interviewed 9 different farmers in this community in Belize. And I was like, that's interesting. And someone said, they're all cousins. And I said, what? And I said, map it out. And they're like, oh, they're all cousins, right? So I thought I was getting this like cross section of society, but I was, everybody was related. And so how does that maybe affect their views on politics, on economics, or how they work together, or how they fight against each other, or something like that, right? So in a lot of communities that anthropologists traditionally work in, kinship is super important, especially in these like non-state level societies. I'm going to live in the Trobriand Islanders like Malinowski and study the Trobrians, right? The provincial or federal government, if there is one, they're pretty far away. They're not super important. What's really important is like your local community and the people who you're related to. So kinship became really important. W.H.R. Rivers, who we should have talked about this semester, and I'll do it next time. One of the really early British anthropologists, 1890s or so, reinvented the genealogical method. Basically, is the guy who said, hey, genealogy is super important when you're studying these so-called primitive people, because their whole life revolves around genealogy. Where you live, where you get your land from, who you can marry, who you vote for in political elections or chiefs or things like that. In a lot of these societies, really depends on who you're related to. So we as anthropologists should really spend a lot of time doing this kind of thing when we go into communities, map it all out and figure out how people are related. In the same way, when you first get to a community, one of the things they first tell you to do is take a map of that community, right? So I go to San Jose and I draw a map. Here's the road and here's all the houses and here's who lives in each of the houses. And then do a kinship chart and it'll show you how those people are related. And you'll start to understand things about why certain neighborhoods are a certain way or why certain people vote together or go to farm in the same area or whatever, right? Super important in anthropology. And it's kind of kept its important, even though what it means to anthropologists have changed, right? The early stuff was all about documentation and description as a tool, right? So I'm going to go to this island community or this Maya community. I'm going to map out these kinship charts so I can understand what the heck is going on, right? By the mid 20th century, we get people like Levi-Strauss, most famously, but also Edmund Leach, who start to use kinship as a way of talking about structuralism. Not just describing anymore, but you remember this from Levi-Strauss, right? when we talk about cross cousin marriage, or we talk about inheritance, or we talk about the incest taboo, we can break down all the real world relations, right? You're my cousin and she's my mom and he's my dad, to this kind of ideal type, right? We can kind of break them down to ideally within the Trobriand Islands, right? There is a good relationship between husband and wife and between parent and child, but a rough relationship between siblings and uncle and child, right? And then we can compare these different relations. So we take kind of the messiness or the complexity of kinship and we break it down to mathematical formulas. I think it's really interesting that Levi-Strauss uses pluses and minuses because it's a really good way to remember like structuralism is all about like, it reminds me a lot of doing like geometry. When I was in geometry class, you have to do those proofs, you know? I feel like that's kind of what you're doing. You're like doing proofs for culture, right? And it's interesting, and Levi-Strauss is a genius. We have to like, you know, give him a shout out and all that. But when you get to the end of the day, like, yeah, that's cool. There are binary oppositions and different cultures set things differently. And yes, Levi-Strauss, we know culture is binary opposition of the human mind played out into the world. Okay, so what else is there, right? By everyone was super impressed with Levi-Strauss, as they always are. But by the 1960s, and especially by the 1970s, when Sally Slocum and her, you know, what we were talking about last time comes around, people are pretty bored. They're like, yeah, so what? Like, this is interesting, but we don't want to go back to description, but we don't also want to just do this. What is this, right? Do you remember one of those other kind of like post World War II perspectives was symbolic anthropology or interpretive anthropology, that kind of Geertz in, Mary Douglas, Victor Turner kind of group, right? A guy named David Schneider, there he is, back in 1949, was part of that kind of symbolic anthropology group. I promise this has to do with our lecture today. And basically said that we oftentimes as anthropologists think of kinship in terms of biology, right? We have this kind of understanding of fathers and mothers and children, and we base this on descent. And very similar to like you might do pedigree charts for dogs or horses or something like that. But he says that we are humans and we are not dogs and horses, and kinship is not biology. Whoa, that's kind of a provocative statement. What does he mean by that? Or more appropriately, kinship, or less provocatively, kinship is not just biology. What does he mean by that? Yeah, definitely, right? This is a kinship chart. If we were only showing, again, we all know this from intro, the circle is ego, right? It could be male or female, either one of us, right? If we were only showing biological relatedness to ego, the one colored in circle, which people would we leave out of this chart? Who are not biologically related, genetically related, as we would use in the modern day? Who is not genetically related to ego? What's that? Well, I mean, in this chart. Yeah, in this chart. Is there anyone who is not genetically related to ego in this chart? I'll give you a hint, there is. Yeah, right? How is this person genetically related to ego? They're not, right? It's my dad's sister's husband. We're not genetically related at all, hopefully, right? Unless things have really gone off the rails, your family tree is more complicated. But in an ideal situation, that person is not related to you at all, nor is this person over here, right? Your mom's brother's wife or your mom's sister's husband or vice versa, right? There's a bunch of people who are not genetically related to you. Are they kin in our system? Yeah, right? They are, what do we call them? Yeah, well, yeah, your uncle, your in-line, your in-laws maybe, right? People you marry into, right? Your outlaws if you don't like them. But we have all these people who we kind of recognize as kin who are not genetically related. Are there other categories of people in our kinship system who are not genetically related to us beyond our, people we've married into families, affines is what we call them in anthropology. Other people in our kinship system who are considered kin, but who are not genetically related to us. This beyond people you marry into. Because if it was just that case, we could be like, oh yeah, it's a special case. Affines. Is there other people? No, no. Yeah, so that's all kind of in you're married into family, but other types of people who we consider kin. What if you had, what is it? Friends, yeah, right. And this is actually, we talk about this in relative values, what we would call your found family, right? And since like the 90s, this has been since the show Friends, you all watch Friends on reruns, I'm sure. Right, the people that you choose to spend your holidays with because you moved away from your family or estranged from your family, right? You create these found families, especially we'll talk about it a little bit within LGBT communities, right? Oftentimes, anthropologists have studied kind of the found familyness of LGBT communities. What about adoption? If you adopt a child, is that child kin? Yeah, are they genetically related to you, even though they're your son or your daughter, right? What about uncles and aunts, right? Are you all from a place or a culture where you got uncles and aunts where you're like, I have no idea how I'm related to that person, or cousins, right? Oftentimes cousins instead of cousins. Who are those people? Who are what are your second, third cousin? But like what about people who aren't related to you at all? Do you have any of those people who are like, oh, that's Uncle Thomas? And you're like, who is that? Oh, that's, that used to be my roommate back in college. And so that's what my kids will call him now. Or, oh, he's like my cousin. Well, like, how are you related? I don't know. We're just cousins from way back, right? Like we're kin somehow. When I lived in West Virginia, people would be like, we're kin. And you're like, well, how are you kin with that person up there? I don't know, long way back, right? We're all kin up here in this holler, right? We all live in the same area. We've all lived here for generations, right? And so oftentimes Schneider makes a point and says, in American society, we have this metaphor of blood is thicker than water, and blood is like the metaphor of our kinship. But our kinship encompasses a whole bunch of other people who aren't necessarily related to us by blood or by genetics. And then instead, we live in a symbolic system, right? We are symbolic creatures, and it's the symbolism of these relationships, how they interact with them, the roles and obligations, which make you kin versus some kind of biology. Just like how you can get estranged from your family if you don't come visit them or ever call them, and those bonds can actually weaken, right? Like you have a cousin who you don't ever talk to, right? We saw them at family reunion 20 years ago. I haven't seen them since, right? You might think of them kind of intellectually as a cousin, but maybe you don't think of them as kin versus somebody who can actually be kind of distant. Like I have cousin Julie, who's like my mom's second cousin, actually. But we see her much more often than some people who I'm much more closely related to, right? So the degree of genetic relatedness, he argues, doesn't necessarily correspond to like our degree of like spending time together or being kind of culturally connected, right? This kind of sets the groundwork for second wave or third wave, I guess, kinship studies in anthropology. First wave being kind of the descriptive, second one being the structural, third wave being this kind of symbolic or kind of textual understanding, right? Very Geertzian, very postmodern. Let's deconstruct what kinship means. So Schneider's had a bunch of students. Probably the one we're going to talk about today is Susan McKinnon. She was my professor at University of Virginia. She wrote Relatively Speaking, which we read this week, along with Sarah Franklin, who is professor at University of Cambridge. I think she's actually at London School of Economics now. But basically, they went to SAR, as the school over in Santa Fe, where they put together, they bring anthropologists who are like, it's like Top Gun for anthropology. They bring the best and the brightest in certain subfields together for a year, 6 months, have them talk about big ideas and then write a book. And that's where this relative values book came from. So McKinnon and Franklin are kind of they're like good representatives of like modern kinship studies. So if you basically say that kinship and gender are kind of symbolically created. They're not these biological categories. It basically opens up kinship studies and makes it more interesting in a way that it hasn't been for a long time, right? Not since Levi-Strauss started putting pluses and minuses on stuff. Basically, since then, nobody had really any interest in it. And Schneider and his kind of students decided that, we're going to shake things up a little bit. And that's what they did. So let's talk about these people, and then we'll jump into the article. So yeah, Susan McKinnon got her PhD in 1983 at Chicago. She studies gender and kinship. And then her fieldwork was in Indonesia. There was a whole bunch of Indonesian kind of anthropology people over at UVA. She did one of her things was kind of doing like restudies of famous anthropological work. So she did, Raymond Firth was an anthropologist who studied in that part of Indonesia in the 1940s. So she basically did a restudy from a different perspective and said that some of his findings were a little bit off. And she did the same thing with Evans Pritchard a little bit later. 83 PhD, Chicago. She was David Schneider's student, the one we just talked about. Okay. She worked in Indonesia, but most of her work is on. Is that showing up? It's not. Sorry, just writing things. To work on kinship and gender. And in particular, she's interested in how. Also at University of University of Chicago, at that time is David Stocking, and he's a historian of anthropology. So she has this kind of interest in the history of anthropology and how, in the same way, right? What was Sally Slocum's argument in the last article? Her big argument was that anthropology, why was anthropology broke? Or what was wrong with anthropology? What was that? They left women out, right? Had a male bias, right? And McKinnon and Franklin are going to argue in this book that following David Schneider, that anthropology throughout its history over the last 100 years has a bias towards biology and kinship. The kinship is overly based on biology, and this is not just an accident, but it's basically taking Western European notions of biology that come out of Darwin and the late 1800s and what we know kinship and biology to be, and kind of putting those on other cultures around the world, right? We are looking at the real science behind kinship, and we'll write about your interesting, strange cultural systems, but what's really going on is this kind of biological relationship, often based on patrilineality or patriarchy and the nuclear family, which, as we've seen kind of throughout as your anthropology career, is not the case everywhere. This book, 2001, Relative Values with Franklin. We'll talk about this in a second. She also has books looking at second cousin or first cousin marriage in the United States and how it used to be kind of the norm, but now has gone to being kind of a weird ick thing and legal in some places, and how that kind of historical trajectory has happened. Sarah Franklin is the other author we're going to talk about. She's the co-author of this book. She's interesting. She's also born in 1960. We're getting to more modern people still alive today. She was notable because she was the first anthropologist to study new reproductive technologies. What does that encompass? When you hear that term, what do you think that means? New reproductive technologies. IVF. Why might things like IVF also, that's kind of what she started with, with the late 70s being like the test tube babies. But also more recently with like prenatal testing, genetic testing of prenatal children with stem cells and kind of stem cell therapy. She also does stuff with like surrogacy and things like that. What do all those categories kind of have in common? And why might that be interesting to the study of kinship? Right, from embryos. But why might things like IVF or surrogacy be interesting to study from the perspective of kinship and anthropology? Yeah, right. It upsets our traditional understandings of kinship and gender, things like that, right? Who is the mom in a surrogacy situation? You can actually have three different moms, right? You could have a genetic donor of the eggs. You could have the woman who carries the baby to term, and then that baby could be adopted by another parent, woman who raises that child. So you have a social mother, a gestational mother, and a genetic mother. Who is the actual mother? If we were drawing our kinship chart, how would you draw that kinship chart? Who are we going to put in this mom box or circle? Could be.
If you're doing it file,
Uh-huh.
the two, and then I guess.
It's complicated, right? Right? We can all have different explanations, and oftentimes it has to do with what the purpose is, right? And depending on like the legal situation, especially when you're trying to determine things like child support or trying to determine things like custody, those different roles can be deployed or pulled back differently, right? And this is what Schneider's point was, that it's genetic. It's not genetic, it's social, and so it's based on legal and cultural kind of norms. And similarly, with IVF, right? How do we count personhood? How do we count who your parents are when you're kind of creating these things in a lab? And this is what one of my students, one of my colleagues in grad school, Jenny Dobrin, was a McKinnon student. And that's what she did. She did her research in Israel on new reproductive technologies, which were funded by the Israeli government, especially with older women. And so what it means to kind of have certain people, who are allowed to access this technology, but Palestinian women not being able to access it, and what it means for statehood and nationhood and personhood and stuff like that. So again, kind of these interesting connections between what kinship is in the modern era and how maybe it's a little bit different from what we might think of traditionally in anthropology, right? Than just that kind of kinship chart. So this is both kind of as a book, it's very wide ranging. Each chapter kind of takes a different topic on modern kinship studies, right? And there's this whole range of things, from people like found families to IVF to migration and kind of globalization in families and how that affects people. There's stuff about genetic markers and how people create family out of that. Let's see. Yeah, so kinship as social. One of the things that McKinnon kind of does in this is, and kind of broadly in her work, is that talks about like modernity and how oftentimes in modernity, in our modern Western world, we often eliminate kinship. One of the features of modernity, right? And I write about modernity in my work. There's lots of things that in our modern world we take for granted. One of those, like that I write about, is kind of the disarticulation of the economic world from the spiritual world, from the social world, right? Your crops are no longer have spirits in them. You don't have to make offerings before you harvest them. Now you're a good modern capitalist, right? McKinnon makes a similar argument with kinship and says that one of the defining features of the modern world is that kinship becomes disarticulated, right? From things like economics and politics. And we often kind of know this kind of instinctually in our society, right? Like if we have kind of a weird relationship, both positively and negatively, with politicians who are like legacy politicians, right? Whose dad or grandpa was a politician. We in the United States tend to elect those people, you know, like the John Quincy Adams of the world, or all the many Kennedys who have run for office just kind of on the strength of their name, or the Bushes, right? We got George W. and George Sr. and Jeb and all of them, right? But there is this kind of sense in our modern world that this is somehow archaic, right? That kind of the family connections are somehow from an earlier era, right? Or oftentimes associated with kind of ethnic culture, right? Oh, Italians or something like that. They're really family based, or Latins or something like that. That there's some kind of negative association with that. Same in business in our culture, right? If you have a bunch of brothers go into business together, oftentimes it's very successful, but it also kind of is looked down, right? You're not making it on your own. It's kind of nepotism. You're hiring someone within our own family. And she makes the point that this is like a very conscious move on our modern era to like disarticulate kinship and put it in the house, right? Kinship stays in the house. It stays at weddings. It stays at holidays. And the politics and economics and all that, that is separate from those kinship ties. You are a modern individual, disarticulated from larger kinship systems, and you engage with the market, buying and sell things as an individual, not as a social group. Let's see, what else does she talk about? Yep. Then they give a bunch of examples of ways, that they can, that this is used, right? So we talked about this, Claire's Thomas's with the surrogacy. Who do you count as mom's gestational, genetic, or social? Which other ones or do we talk about? Talk about another example in this book. One of the authors talks about China and how kinship ties are kind of being reconfigured, especially in terms of one child per family policy in the 1970s and 80s in China, and what that means in a culture where you don't have like Social Security and you depend on your children to kind of take care of you in your old age, but you also have these patterns of migration to the city and how people have to kind of recreate new kinship patterns in that case. Another case of grandparents in France. Again, how do grandparents figure into these roles, especially as marriage becomes increasingly brittle in Europe, right? France with a more than 50% divorce rate. And so oftentimes it's the grandparents who kind of keep the family together. So how are grandparents consciously trying to do this, especially in these like mixed and hybrid families? How do you create these kind of new traditions to make yourself like a real family? What else is there? A lot of what they do is talking about substance, and another one of McKinnon's students who we actually had come visit us. A couple years ago for our student, for our Cynthia Irwin Williams lectureship, Rose Wellman was interested in this kind of side of McKinnon stuff, right? So what did Schneider say that the dominant metaphor of kinship in Euro-American society was? The dominant metaphor. We already talked. What is thicker than water? What is it? Blood. Yeah, we have blood. That in other cultures, this metaphor of blood isn't necessarily the only dominant one, right? In other ones, it's milk. And we have kind of a holdover of this if you've watched and read any Game of Thrones, right? Milk Brothers or something like that. People who nurse together are seen to have some kind of kinship. And kind of on a broader scale, food. So Dr. Wellman, who was McKinnon's student, did her research in Iran on food and kinship. And basically her point was that kinship is made by feeding people, right? You can see who your kin is based on who you feed at these big feast events and who you don't feed, who you exclude, right? And this is kind of marking the boundaries of food, you know, and culture. Other seed and soil metaphors, these are all metaphors. So like in Abrahamic cultures, talking about how, you know, oftentimes there's this agricultural metaphor of, you know, the man depositing his seed into the woman, like soil of agriculture. But if you live in a hunter and gatherer society or a pastoralist society, these metaphors of kinship become very different. She has really interesting stuff, which I think is cool on family businesses. She has one on like companies. There's a drum maker in Turkey, and there's a you know that's been in business since like 1400 or 1500. And she does some research in Japan with like a hotel that's been owned by the same family since like 900 AD or something like that. So it's really interesting in how, you know, within these economic systems, you have, you know, kinship still plays a big part of these things. Let's see, what else is interesting in here? Yep, surrogacy, Jewish Orthodox, yep, IVF, genetic medicine. They also talk about marriage and who you can marry and how that's also changed, right? Before, kind of in traditional societies, you're going to be marrying someone oftentimes from a very close, you know, group, family, you know, second cousins or something like that, or somebody from a neighboring clan, and how globalization has really changed that. Where can you marry someone from today? Just anywhere really, right? And sometimes, and it's really interesting, especially in this kind of global internet age, right? And people have used this to do work on mail order brides, right? So like, how do people use the internet to kind of date across these boundaries and transact money, right? There's this kind of weird, again, we tend to think of kinship as very separate from economics, but there's often this kind of economic exchange. And we tend to think of these arrangements as what? Somebody's like, I got a mail order bride from the Ukraine. This is my new wife, Olga. What's kind of your initial reaction to that? Yeah, right. There was sex trafficking, that you bought your wife and you like put her in a box and shipped her over here, right? And why do we think that? Yeah, it's dehumanizing, but they were saying, right, this is kinship, right? This is kinship, and this is how kinship has been for a long time, right? We think of this idea of like love matches. I love you so much. Let's spend our life together and be best friends as well as economic and sexual partners and raise children together, is again a very Western kind of configuration of a lot of different roles that in other societies may not be the same, right? Just because you've paid money to arrange this marriage, you know, oftentimes these women are getting something out of it as well. They're getting out of these terrible situations, these war-torn countries, or they're getting citizenship or something like that. And so they would actually do kind of interviews with people on both sides of these things. And it's super interesting, kind of the reasons why people get involved in all of this, right? What else? What else is interesting right here? But it's a really super interesting book, more for like the breadth of ideas that I think it gives you, right? That like once you read this introduction, you're like, oh, kinship. I always thought it was kind of boring before, right? I thought it was circles and triangles and you know, mapping out who's my cousin. I can never remember what's the difference between a second cousin and a first cousin once removed. But naturally, you can use it to talk about all these different kind of interesting configurations, which technology and globalization, the media and the internet all kind of make possible. And one of the things that's been interesting to look at, they've kind of kept doing this. I think it's been since, pretty sure it's been since this book, because it's in 2001, is with like internet families through something like 23andMe. What is that all about? What is 23andMe or something like that? Yeah, you like send in a swab of your spit or something like that, and they tell you, well, 43% Southern European and 21% Irish and 16% indigenous or something like that, right? They give you kind of a percentage, but it also hooks you into these kind of family trees, other people who have submitted data in this and kind of create these connections. And oftentimes there's this weird interaction between people who are really into this genetic genealogy as well as like the Mormon side of things with the, you know, tracing your family tree and for religious reasons. And this has actually had implications in like the criminal justice sector, right? As people who have submitted their DNA for like, oh, I want to find out about my family. And then the cops will use that to, you know, as a proxy for looking for murderers or serial killers or things like that. So kind of how these new forms of testing and genetic, you know, this is all fairly new. I'm not really sure this, because you all are younger than I am. Like this is stuff that came out when I was in college. Like we are going to map the human genome. It's going to change, you know, everything. And now you can send in like $50 and send in your DNA to get sequenced. And it's like completely normalized now. But it is super interesting, especially in the context of you know, what we think of as family and relations. Other ones that have been kind of interesting. Another one of our professors at UVA, Richard Handler, was kind of interested in this idea of kinship and nationhood, right? How oftentimes in modern nationalism, we have this sense of being a family, right? We're all Americans. We need to come together as a family. How do we all get to be a family there, right? How do nationhood and nationalism oftentimes use family as a metaphor? What do you think? What is the relationship between the nation and the family? Or is there a relationship? Give you a hint, anthropologists say yes, and it's a very hot topic. At least it was in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, right. There's lots of narratives of brotherhood, of the nation, right? Like of the Statue of Liberty standing at Ellis Island, be like, come, let me take care of you immigrants, right? Almost as a mother welcoming these people. And you have this some kind of solidarity, right? Again, it's kind of this blood is thicker than water, that we're all Americans, and when times get tough, we stick together, right? And that nations and nation states being kind of this constructed artificial thing often draw on these like very primordial discourses of kinship in order to make people feel like they're part of something. What else? We're almost done. Again, adoption is super interesting, especially transnational adoption. People have done work on people who adopt children from other cultures, right? This one here is Norwegian people who adopt Korean babies, but also, you know, people are adopting Chinese babies, I think a decade or so ago. You know, Angelina Jolie going and adopting people from, you know, kids from Malawi, or Madonna adopting children from other places, right? It's kind of like a celebrity thing. And then how, again, in this globalized world, how do we make those people kin, right? Like, so how do you, if you're a Norwegian parent, how do you make your kid who you've adopted from Korea, who is genetically Korean, how do you make them Norwegian, right? And a lot of these things that we think of as like, you know, naturally Norwegian, the culture, right? The food, the language, how you try to like impact or influence somebody into that, but also how you still try to keep their roots, right? How you organize these kind of trips back to Korea to, you know, introduce people to their culture, even though they've been adopted into different places. How much time do we have? A few minutes. Let's see what else. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. I guess we can just kind of end on that. This idea that, you know, kinship is much more than what we think of in like intro to anthropology or intro to cultural, where it's like, let's do who are you allowed to marry, or who are you related to? But when you start to look at kinship as symbolic rather than something biological, that you can really start to see how different cultures do it differently, right? Some cultures are going to be, you know, if you're in the previous class, back in 340, right? When we talk about Haudenosaunee people a couple of weeks ago, Iroquois, they call themselves people of the Longhouse, right? This is a metaphor for their kinship, right? Everyone who lives in that longhouse together is considered family. You're all probably related to a clan mother, but you also could marry into that. But that's the basic unit of kinship. But it also becomes the unit of politics. It becomes a metaphor for their entire governing system and for society, right? So when you start to pull back from this biological, understanding of kinship, that it opens it up to studying kinship from a much more interesting and productive angle, whether you're looking at metaphors of nationhood or whether you're looking at new reproductive technologies or how globalization has changed marriage, right? All these are topics which are interesting and available to you now. Okay, and again, this is very postmodern, right? You're kind of destabilizing what kinship is. What is kinship really, right? And this happened in all the different subfields of anthropology, whether it's economics, whether it's kinship or environment. Postmodernism is like, what is environment? What is kinship, right? And then kind of on the other hand, it's a relationship of power, right? Who's in control here? And how does that happen, right? So I'm going to study new reproductive technologies in Israel. This is the Jenny Doven project, right? Older motherhood. So the Israeli government gives free IVF to women over 50 to have babies, which is kind of interesting and very science fiction-y. But only certain kinds of women get it, right? You have to be the right kind of woman. You have to be Jewish. You can't be Palestinian. Why is that? Yeah, right. There's more Jewish people, right? They're concerned about the birth rate of Palestinian women being 8 children per woman versus 1 or 2 for a Jewish woman. So they're trying to like boost up the birth rate as part of this nationalist program, right? So we don't want to be, demographically outcompeted. So oftentimes when we talk about kinship, whether it's, extreme case like that, but also much closer to home, right? Whether it's in terms of abortion rights here in the United States or who gets to count as kinship or who gets to count, with your gender, whether you get to count as a circle or a triangle, and who gets to decide whether that's you, whether that's your community, or whether that's the government, right? These are all modern issues, and right, and kinship often gets this reputation as like old-timey anthropology, but I think it's increasingly relevant because issues of reproduction, issues of gender, and issues of relatedness and citizenship, marrying across borders for citizenship, and all that, are all really modern, relevant anthropology topics and have been the subject of some really great dissertations in recent years. So that's all we have time for. What I really like about this stuff is these people are all still alive, right? Sally Slocum still alive, but Franklin McKinnon still alive and still working. Like you can really like their stuff. I'll write you a letter of recommendation to UVA, and you can go and study with Susan McKinnon, right? So I think that's really cool. And we're going to talk next week about other people who are still relevant and still doing work into the modern era, which I think is always nice because then it's not just like theory happened a long time ago and we're living in a post-theoretical or postmodern age. Okay, that is it for today as well as for the week. Thanks so much for hanging out, and I'll see you on Monday for our last topic of the semester.